Now, in this lecture, let's talk about cognitive development. Now, before we go on, let's define what is cognition. Well, the psychological meaning of cognition is really about thinking, and this includes perception and learning, problem solving, judgment, and memory. And a lot of people would actually equate consciousness with cognition. Okay, so cognition really is about a conglomerate of what you are basically thinking, and then the way that you are basically processing information from many different modalities, and together they kind of mesh together, and then they form a bigger, a whole experience, a mental experience that is like unconsciousness. Now there are many aspects of cognition, as you can see, that is listed here: perception, learning, problem solving, judgment, and memory. And we're going to go through quite a bit of them today. Now, when we talk about theories about cognitive development, the founding father that really started with all of that is the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Okay, and he was really a wonderful theorist and really wonderful scientist, in the sense that he was really able to watch how children grow up and behave, and then really made great inferences to what these people are, how these children must be developing. And then he, after talked to a lot of people, and throughout a lot of research, was able to come up with a really wonderful and systematic stages of development that we're going to talk about later. And then this is just something that really was very prominent and really pushed the education. And also Piaget was very big on education. Okay, he served as the chief of educational bureau in Switzerland for many years, and then he has his own educational programs. And so there is just really a wonderful man who really devoted his life to understand how children develop. Okay, now what about the actual theories about cognitive development? Okay, so now there are many advantages, but your book actually listed three. So the three advantages of knowing about child development theories is that the first, child development theories, they really provide a framework for understanding important phenomena. So in other words, these theories, they use something that they observed, and then they were able to categorize them together and say that this is a very important phenomenon that a lot of people go through when they are maturing, during childhood, and then and we think that this is the reason why. So Piaget was very good at extracting the reason behind an observation, and he was very good at extracting and providing meaning. He really was very good at giving good labels to whatever he is observing in a child. And then also from a lot of other sources, such as parents, his own observations, and then also a lot of research. Okay. And the next reason is that the developmental theories raise crucial questions about human nature. Okay, and the third reason is that development theories lead to a better understanding of children. Okay, so this last one, I want to say slightly a little bit more about. So the theory, they really stimulate new research that can support the theory's claims, or it can dispute them, or it kind of required to refine the theories. And this really actually provide our understanding of children. So one of the things I want to bring out is that, and the way that you see that Piaget really approached it, is that he would make an observation. He would say that, I wonder if this theory is true. Okay, if it's true, then I hypothesize that under these circumstances, this is what's going to happen to the child or the children, and then let me test it out. So he was really an avid scientist. He would go out and test these hypotheses and try to see if what he had postulated or predicted was correct, or what was he incorrect. Now, if he is correct, he would of course he would have supported his claim, right? Now, if he was incorrect in doing so, then he would go back and fix it, and then say that, okay, how would I change my interpretation of these data and that we're getting, and then how and because I'm changing the way that I am interpreting these data, should I also modify my theory? Okay, so you can see that Piaget was very good at doing this, generating theory, then find out if he is correct. Well, first of all, he generated a theory, and then after that, he would make a hypothesis about something, and then he would actually go out and test them, would make a further observation, and then he will come back and see if the data he got or the behavior he observed, does it fit with his hypothesis? Does it support or does it refute his hypothesis? And if it's not supported, then he will go back and modify his original claim, and then and he might even go back to reinterpret or modify his theory about something. And so you can see that this in the entire work of Piaget is really very well based on some very sound science. Okay, so now, so there's a lot of things that we can learn about how Piaget is. Okay, now we're gonna talk. So today I'm gonna talk to you very briefly about what his cognitive development theories and stages that he proposed. Now, let me tell you why Piaget's theory of development is so popular. Now, your book is pretty good at listing them, but I just want to add before here my own point of view, okay? And the reason why Piaget's theory of development is so popular to me is that he really is a wonderful scientist. Not only he's a wonderful scientist, he's a wonderful observationist, which means he's very good at observing a child and then really infer what they must be thinking and then forming his own theories and then make observations and and then test his hypothesis. Okay, so and then you'll see that very few studies in cognitive psychology has yet to prove Piaget wrong. And then the reason for that is Piaget is so meticulous and so vivid when it comes to his observations and his description of behavior. Okay, now his interpretation might be a little bit off, but then not very often. Okay, and because when he is writing about his interpretation, he will also write something that is kind of like an alternative explanation for this kind of stuff. Okay, so he really is a wonderful scientist and theorist when you kind of think about it. Okay, and so there are very few holes in his theories that you can find. All right, so that's the first and the second reason that we have talked. Okay, now another reason why Piaget's theory is so popular is that this is very useful to parents, teachers, nurses, daycare people, pediatricians, and basically any role that has to come in contact with children. You need to, it's useful, this Piaget theory is useful to you. Okay, now the third one is the exceptional breadth to the theory. Okay, and you can see that this goes from the infancy to adolescence. Okay, and then the top is very wide. It really goes from the conceptualization of time, space, distance, number, language, learning and memory, problem solving, scientific reasoning. So it really talks about a very broad aspect of cognitive development. Okay. And then the last reason that your textbook mentioned is that this is also a very good depiction of the interaction of the nature and nurture problem, as well as the continuity and discontinuity that characterize intellectual growth. Now, let me talk to you briefly about the Piaget's theories and what his central developmental issues are. Okay, now Piaget, in terms of the nature and nurture, he really believed that nature and nurture interact together to produce cognitive development. And as you saw from the previous lectures, in terms of how the nervous system develops, you really know that this is true. There is something that if you don't do anything, you see like the natural rise and fall of the number of dendritic spines, for instance. And then you also saw the rise and fall of the actual development of the neuronal morphologies for another instance. But you also saw, so that is like the nature part of it, right? But you also saw that how life experiences in the manipulation in the sensory activities or the environmental enrichment, how that can also interact with the development. Okay, so in this sense, Piaget, and of course, he's not like a neuroscientist, but then he innately believed that there is a combining with the role of nature and nurture together, and then nature includes like children's maturing mind and body, and the nurture part really is of course, as we know, is how the environmental and the significant experiences that they believe in. Okay, and then now when you look at continuity versus discontinuity, you see that Piaget depicted development as involving both continuities and discontinuities. Okay, now the main sources of the continuity really comes from these three processes. Okay, the assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. Okay, so all of these, they work together from birth to propel development forward. And we'll talk about it in the next slide. Okay, now when it comes to the sources of this continuity, Piaget really he really have a good aspect when it comes to like the distinct stages of cognitive development. And so these are something you guys probably have learned during your Psych 101 class, but these are like the very famous ones: the sensory motor stage, which goes from birth to 2 years of age, and then there's a pre-op stage, pre-operational stage, that is ages 2 to 7, and so this is before elementary school. And then in the concrete operational stage, this is from 7 to 12 years old, and you see that this is from elementary school to the end of elementary school. Okay, and so this is from 7 to 12 years of age. And then in the final stage, the formal operational stage, this is from 12 years old and beyond. So this is when the adolescent and adults, they can think deeply and not just concretely, but also abstractions. So we'll talk more about each one of them. And you can see that there is a certain reason that why he kind of took them in this age. And when you kind of think about them, this is very interesting, because the sensory motor stage from birth to 2 years of age, this is where like most people would most infants would spend at home with the mother, right? And then from ages 2 to 7 years of age, this is like from preschool to kindergarten years. All right, and then from the country operational stage, 7 to 12 years, so this is the elementary school years. And then after that, the formal operational stage from 12 years and young, this is from junior high and on, right? So you can see that I said before, Piaget is an educationalist, right? So he was also very good at, and very, I would say somewhat conveniently group these together based on the school systems. Very interesting. Now, there are sources about continuity that Piaget really described them pretty well. And so the main sources for continuity are these three processes: the assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. Okay. And so assimilation is the process by which people incorporate incoming information into concepts they already understand. So basically, it's about like you taking something very similar to what you already know and you trying to fit that piece of information into your head by kind of meshing with what you already know. Okay, so that's the process called assimilation. Now, accommodation is when people try to improve their current understanding in response to new experiences. So in other words, that you can see that accommodation is more kind of like your mind making new space for this new experience or learning new memories of due to a new experience. So accommodation, I would kind of think of it as a new spine growing in this sense. Okay, accommodation, you can see that there are a lot of learning that is involved. Okay, now equilibration really is about the process by this is the balance between assimilation and accommodation to create stable understanding. And you see that equilibration really includes three phases. So the first people, they're satisfied with their understanding of a particular phenomenon. And then, so Piaget labeled this as a state of equilibrium because people do not see any discrepancies between their observations and their understanding of the phenomenon. And then new information let them understand basically what they are understanding is inadequate, and then this realization put people in a state of disequilibrium. So you can see that that balance is off right now. Okay, and then they recognize shortcomings in their own understanding, but then they cannot generate a superior alternative. So basically, what they're trying to say is that people, when they are not understanding something, they get confused. And then there is kind of a more sophisticated understanding that eliminates the shortcoming of the old one. And this creates a more advanced stage of equilibrium. And then this kind of let them say that, oh, okay, we're kind of expanding your understanding of a certain aspect. So you can see that this equilibrium as well as the disequilibrium is really what is the driving force of what actually propels the further development. So this is why it's called the source of continuity. Okay, and you can see that because we as human beings, or any organisms really, when we go through this world, we are always coming with things that are new, and then we understand, we sometimes get confused with the new stuff, and then therefore we think that there is something that's insufficient inside us, and then because of that we actually need to improve our understanding, improve our understanding with the world, and that is what propels us. That's kind of what motivates us to further interact with the world, to further understand the world more uh, by really assimilate and accommodate what we thought is not enough understanding of the world that is inside us. So in other words, Piaget's idea is that we are always trying to gather data from the world. And when we feel like there is something in the world we're not getting, either because there is a rule that we're not getting, or if there is a source that is kind of in this discontinuity or some sort of a disbelief, a sense of disalignment. I think that's a better word, a disalignment from our current understanding. And then this is going to create both of the disequilibrium in terms of the assimilation as well as the accommodation. And this is how, and this is true throughout life, and this is why it's called the source of continuity. This happens when you are born, and this happens like basically before you die. Okay, so this is why he calls the source of continuity. So this three processes, the accommodation, assimilation, and equilibration. Equilibration is really all. This is kind of like a repeating theme that we keep going on in the rest of our lives. This is why this is the source of continuity. Now let's talk about the sources of discontinuity. Okay, so now you'll see that the Piaget really have an idea of what is continuous aspect when it comes to the cognitive development, but his most famous part of his theory really is about these four different stages, where he really described like a very distinct stages of cognitive development. So for Piaget, he really saw these stages as part of the basic human tendency to organize knowledge into coherent structures. Okay, so now each stage really represents a very specific and very significant developmental stage, and you can see that. Now I want to just point out, just because let's say the sensory motor stage is birth to 2 years of age. Okay, it does not necessarily mean that okay, this child just had his second birthday, and then tomorrow you're gonna wake up and then you're gonna see this as all of a sudden you'll be like, oh wow, how come you're just all of a sudden so much smarter? No, it doesn't really work that way. But then, and it's not like a sudden jump that happens overnight. But then there is a certain point in the life, all of a sudden there is kind of like a growth spurt when it comes to the development. So you kind of see it as when, let's say for instance, the sensory motor stage is from birth to 2 years of age, right? And then the pre-operational stage is from 2 to 7 years old. All right. Now, something I want to bring up is that you will see that from 0 to 2, you will see them as kind of one stage, but then all of a sudden, when you get to 2.5 years old, and then to a certain stage after that, you will see this kid is very different in terms of their capability to process stuff is much more there's a much more improvement to it. So the sensory motor stage, uh, you can see that the infants, their intelligence really only expressed through their sensory and motor activities. Okay, so they can't really do anything else. Really, they're not really capable to think something that's very abstract. If you teach them arithmetic at this stage, they won't understand it. Okay, and as we have said before in the previous slides, and this is because their brain is still very well developing at that point. Okay, and you see that each one of these stages really correlate very well with like a certain amount of brain development as well. Okay, so during the sensory motor stage, as we said before, this is where this is where like all the dendrites are growing, right? And this is also where like the synaptogenesis are occurring. Synaptogenesis, all right, is occurring. And then now during that pre-operational stage, you see that there is some continuous synaptogenesis as well as increasing dendrite. But then at the end of this stage, you start to see some pruning of the dendrite. Now it depends on where in the cortex you're looking at, okay? But you see that, and at this point, but during the pre-operational stage, the prefrontal lobe is only starting to go through a synaptogenesis, as opposed to in the sensory cortices, you already start to see some pruning already. So you see that there is some disproportionate growth and pruning of the dendritic spines when it comes to these difference in sources when it comes to the different operational stages. Okay, now so I don't want to talk too much about the brain during this, but I just kind of want to offer you some ideas what we have learned before and how they pretty much correlate with Piaget's ideas when it comes to the development. Now let's talk about the first stage. So the first stage is sensory motor stage. During this initial phase of development, children, they really utilize and the abilities that they have that they were born with, such as looking, sucking, grasping, listening, or crawling, just kind of move around. And they use this to learn about the environment. Okay, and then so in other words, they really experience the world and gain knowledge through their senses and motor movements. Now, through trial and error, they really discover more about the world that around them. So Piaget really chose to call the stage the sensory motor stage because it is through the senses and the motor abilities that infants gain like a very basic understanding of the world around us. So you can see that there's a lot of not assimilation but like a accommodation, because right now they are really learning so much about the world. Okay, and then once they construct a map about the world, then you can see that this accommodation, assimilation, equilibration process start to go around. Okay, and then that is going to continue throughout life. So the ability for the infant that they're born with, like sight, all the five senses, combined with the physical capability that kind of continue to develop, such as touching, grasping, tasting, and this really allows the baby or the infant to interact and build awareness of who they are and what is surrounding them. Okay. Now, as children interact with their environment, they go through like a good amount of cognitive growth when in a very relatively short period of time. Because when you think about it, all of these are new to them, and so the sensory motor stage lasts them about from birth to approximately age 2. Okay, now there is something very important term that I want to say, and then this is object permanence. Okay, so this is the knowledge that objects continue to exist even when they are out of view. So when you try to hide something so let's say if you try to cover something up and then without moving it, the child before that they would kind of assume that something is gone. So this is why you always kind of play the peekaboo, where I'm here, I'm here, I'm not here, I'm not here, and then when the children start not seeing their mom or got covered by something, they start to panic and they start to cry, right? And that's because the infants at this age, they don't have object permanence yet, and so now object permanence really comes from at the end of the sensory motor stage. Okay, so basically you'll see that this is a very important stage in in anybody's life. Okay, because this is where they gather enough data to really construct the world around them. Okay, now let's talk about the pre-operational stage. Now, Piaget really viewed this period as kind of striking cognitive acquisition and also equally striking limitations. All right, and you'll see that one of the most important aspect is symbolic representation when it comes to the acquisition, and then the most notable weaknesses are the egocentrism and centration. Okay, So at this stage, they are really developing the symbolic representation. Okay, so that means that they can use the object, words, or thoughts to stand for another. So, and this is the result that directly comes from object permanence, of course. So you can see that object permanence is a prerequisite for symbolic representation. And so this is when they can draw symbols of the sun just by looking at the sun, and then they can, and then when you point to like a drawing of a sun, they know that this is the sun, and so forth. Okay, and so they are going to start to so they start to get some of these symbols of what things really mean, and then they can kind of look at the drawing and then relate to the real thing. So this is what we know about the symbolic representation. So this is one of the major developments during the pre-operational stage. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is egocentrism. Okay, so now, the Piaget is this is one of the limitations in their thinking, and this is egocentrism. Okay, so which basically mostly is regarding the world solely evolves from their own point of view. Okay, and so the example of that is kind of like preschoolers' difficulty, like taking other people's like perspectives. So this is the thing that is that we're seeing in the cartoon over here. Okay, so you can see the conversation between the two children. My dad is a policeman, and then this children said, "I have a real big dog," and then the child on the left says he caught a robber once. And then the child on the right says he licks my face all the time. So you can see that they're both talking about themselves. They're not really talking about the other person. They fail to see the other person's point of view. So this is something that is a major limitation when it comes to this pre-operational stage, and that is uh, the children's motives. They are basically centered around themselves. Okay. Now the next limitation, a major limitation when it comes to the preschoolers thinking, is centration. Okay, so that is focusing on a single perceptually striking feature of an object or event to the exclusion of the other relevant but less striking features. Okay, this has another name on that, and this is something called functional fixedness. So which means that when you look at something, you don't see it as, you only see it as the primary function of doing something, rather than using it as an alternative tool to achieve like another meaning. So for instance, if you ask a child what does the keyboard or the computer do, they would tell you that, oh, my dad uses it like a lot to watch videos and stuff like that. But then, but they do not also think of its other alternative purposes. For instance, you can use computer as a weight to hold down, let's say, the pages of paper to avoid it from being blown away. Okay, so they don't see this, they don't see the computer of having another function that can serve some other else. They just see it as the primary function. And that's one of the things is the centration. Okay, so this is the idea. You see that this is something called the functional fixedness. Okay. Now let's talk about the concrete operational stage, and that is the third stage in Piaget's theory of cognitive development. This period spans the time of the middle childhood. So this is basically the elementary school years, okay? And now this stage is characterized by the development of logical thought. But we'll come back to like which logical thoughts they can do and which logical thoughts they can't do. Okay, now thinking still tends to be more concrete, And children at this age, they become much more logical and sophisticated in their thinking during the stage of development. But now this is an important stage of itself. It's also like it's a very important transitional stage between earlier stages of development and the coming stage where kids learn to think in more abstractly and hypothetically. So, which means that at this stage they cannot think abstract and hypothetical thoughts yet. Okay, now Piaget determined that the children in the concrete operational stage were fairly good at the use of inductive logic. Okay, now inductive logic involves going from one specific experience to a general principle. So, for instance, it's like every time you are around a cat, you have like itchy eyes, a running nose, and a sore throat. You might then kind of start to reason that, oh, this is probably because you are allergic to cats. Okay, now on the other hand, children at this stage, they're not very good at using deductive logic. And so this involves using a general principle to determine the outcome of a specific event. So for instance, the children, they might learn that A equals B and B equals C, but they still have struggle to understand that A equals C. Okay, so their deductive logic is not very good yet. So they're not able to just learn something and then just to reflect it into like other aspects of their life. Okay, but they can make a one association to another pretty well. Okay, now the next thing that's very striking about this stage is that they understand reversibility. So this is one of the most important development in this stage is to understand the reversibility. So this is basically aware that the actions can be reversed. Okay, for example, the example of this is being able to reverse the order of the relationship between mental categories. Okay, now on the other hand, children at this age, they have difficulty uh, really understanding like abstract thoughts, as we said before. They're not able to and the abstract thoughts as well as the hypothetical thoughts. This comes much later when it comes to the formal operational stage. Okay. Now let's talk about the last stage, and that is the formal operational stage. Okay, now this stage goes from 12 to and into adulthood, basically the rest of the life. Okay, and now at this point in development, thinking becomes much more sophisticated and advanced. Kids at this stage, well, and also later in adulthood, they can think about abstract and theoretical concepts, and they can use these logic to come up with creative solution to problems. So skills such as logical thought, deductive reasoning, and systematic planning also start to emerge in this stage. So, so one of the tasks that they use is conceptualizing balance. So this is one task that they ask the children of different ages to balance the scale by pretty much like putting the weight on the each end to balance the scale. And children need to be at 12 years old or older to really understand that both the heaviness and the distance from the center of the scale. Okay, younger children, they can do this okay, but then the concepts, they're really not that great yet. So it wasn't really until age 12 or 13 that the children can really use this logic to really have an idea of what this task really takes. Okay, now the next one is the abstraction of ideas. So basically, this is another set of experiments. So Piaget asked children to imagine where they would want a place of a third eye if they had one. Okay, so you can kind of think that the younger children said that they would put the imagined third eye in the middle of the forehead. the older children, they will want to come up with a variety of creative ideas where they will put this hypothetical I and various ways that I could be used for. So for instance, they might say, I want it on my hand, because this way, when my hand goes into a place, like a dark place, or like in the bag, I can know exactly what I'm looking for, something like that, okay? Okay, now there's also the idea of deductive logic. This is something that we said that they cannot do in the previous stage, right? But they're quite good at this formal operational stage. So Piaget really believed that deductive reasoning comes from necessary during the formal operational stage. Now, this deductive logic requires the ability to use general principle to determine a particular outcome. So, which means that you need to have a good amount of science and mathematical background in order to come up with like hypothetical situation and concepts. Okay. The next one is abstract thoughts. Okay. So abstract thought is basically the ability to think about more abstract concepts. They really they're not very well developed in the previous stages, so they don't really come into the abstract thoughts uh, fully matured until they're in the formal operational stage. Even in the beginning of the formal operational stage, they're not that well yet, but starting from 13 or 14 years of age, about puberty, then you can see that they start to come up a little bit more. The problem solving also, the children in the earlier stage, they would use trial and error methods to solve problems. But during this formal operational stage, since they have much more prior experiences, and also they gain enough knowledge about the world and how things work, and essentially they kind of found out about the rules about the environment and how the world kind of works in the environment around them, they start to gain the ability to systematically solve a problem in a logical and a methodological way. And so the children at this point, the point more like gals and girls, right? Children at this formal operational stage, they are often able to plan quickly and organize approach to solve a problem. Okay, now the last one is the hypothetical deductive reasoning. So Piaget really believed what he refers to as the hypothetical deductive reasoning was essential at this stage of intellectual development. So at this point, teens become capable of how do I say this? They're capable thinking about the abstract and hypothetical ideas. So these are the things like what if type of situations. So this is something that we talk a lot about during our discussion. So I would often ask you, what if this kind of hypothetical scenarios, right? So this is something that but you see that in your earlier years, let's say in your middle school or your high school years, your professors or your teachers don't really ask you to engage in this kind of uh, hypothetical situations, right? And there's a reason for that, and that's because and then your ability to really extract these kind of what if situations is really not that well developed yet. So the hypothetical deductive reasoning really develops much later. I know that the formal operational stage starts at 2, but then this hypothetical deductive reasoning really is one of the latest to develop. And then I have to kind of argue that because this process that we're talking about is a very prefrontal lobe process, okay? And as we said before, the prefrontal cortex really develops very late and continues to develop even when you reach adulthood. Even at your age right now in early 20s or late teens, you're still developing those skills. So so the hypothetical deductive reasoning does not even come like fully mature until right about your age right now. So this is when you start to have a little bit more um, mature thinking when it comes to the make believe scenarios. Okay. Now, if you start to say, "Oh, I was able to do that," well, yeah, at a very young age, well, then congratulations, your IQ must be pretty high compared to other people around your same age. Because when Piaget looked at a lot of children, this hypothetical deductive reasoning is one of the very last things to develop. Now, for the rest of the lecture, let me go through the cognitive development in general, and I'm going to show you some of the data in terms of what we really have a consensus on. All right, and I'm going to tell you over several areas when it comes to the cognition. Okay, so we're going to go through executive functioning first, and then we'll talk about problem solving ability, and then processing speed, and the last thing we'll talk about memory. And specifically, we'll talk about working memory. Okay, now we've said this before that your brain continues to mature even in your 20s, particularly in the prefrontal lobe, right? And the prefrontal lobe, as you can see, is really this area that I'm circling. Okay. Now you're probably thinking that what is the difference between frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex? And all right, so frontal lobe is basically everything that you are seeing from this primary motor cortex to everything that you see like that is in the yellow. Okay, now the prefrontal cortex really is pretty much all the yellow part. Okay, so is the prefrontal cortex is basically everything minus that primary motor cortex. You don't have to know this for your exam. I'm just kind of showing you this is the case, okay? Now let's talk about what is executive functioning, okay? So executive functioning really is the control of cognition. And you'll see that the prefrontal cortex really is a very important role in this cognitive control. And now there are like a lot of types that really are involved in executive functioning. So there are many different components. So there is like the planning aspect. So we'll go through the list. Okay, I think this is a very simplified version, but this gets the job done pretty well. Okay, so the first thing is to organize, prioritize, and activate work. Okay, so like your organizational skills and how you think, what is the most important thing, what should be done first, what should be done second, what is important and what is urgent. All of that stuff is that's part of the executive functioning. Okay, and the next thing is the monitor and self-regulate actions. So this is what your book is basically talking about, inhibiting inadvisable actions. So which means that you need to regulate, you need to do a lot of like self-regulation of thoughts and stuff like that. So this is like an inhibition of that. And so this is also known as a cognitive control, okay? So a lot of times you know that, oh, this is the thing that I know that if I said it, I will regret it. So you learn to bite your tongue, for instance. That is definitely a part of executive function because you are actually thinking ahead that if you say something wrong, this will have some bad repercussion on your life, okay? Okay, the next thing is it utilizes working memory and short-term memory recall. Okay, now so the executive functioning definitely has a memory component to it, but you see that this working memory is really more about manipulating briefly what you have going on in your mind, what you have been recently presented with. Okay, so and we'll talk about working memory later. Okay, and the next aspect when it comes to the executive functioning is managing frustration, and modulate emotions. So you can see that this is also a very important part, that you do something that you know will be the best for you despite the fact that you hate it. Okay. And or you kind of modulate your emotion, you don't let it really show it, if you know that this can be detrimental for you. So this really takes a very high order of self-control. And you'll see that this development of executive functioning is really not fully developed until you're in the 20s, sometimes even in your 30s. Okay, so and as we said before, that's because your prefrontal lobe does not fully become mature in your 20s until you're in the 20s. Okay, and then they continue to mature even after your 20s, in your 20s. Okay, the next one is the regulate alertness, sustain effort, and speed. Okay, so that's pretty self-explanatory. And then the very last one is this is the attention component to it. So if the ability to focus, sustain, and ability to shift task attention. So you have often heard about multitasking, right? Multitasking is one of the key components of executive functioning. Okay, so set shifting meaning that, let's say you're doing your biology homework, and you're also hungry at the same time, so you are going to cook something while you're doing your biology homework because that saves time. Okay, so so you have to constantly go back to say that, oh, let me go watch to see if that thing on the stove is it being burned. Okay, and then the next thing I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna do my homework, and then another maybe 2 minutes later I'm gonna go watch that food to see if it's burned. So this set shifting of attention really is also a major part of the executive functioning. Now, you'll see that the executive functioning skill, they're really not very well developed during the early years. Okay, and you can see that from age 0 to 6, basically there is not that much executive functioning that is going on. And then, so on the y-axis, what basically you're seeing, this is the executive function skill proficiency. Okay, and you'll see that even when it's like from 12 to, I guess this is 13 or 15, I think it's 13. Okay, there is still not that well developed compared to when the person reach their 25 to 29 years of age. You can see that there is still more that is developing. Okay, now one of the things I want to say to you is that you should really try to do something meaningful with your life while you're still young. And that is because after you start to hit 40, that executive functioning skill start to go down again. You can see that from 40 years age and so on, this is going like a downhill. Okay, so definitely utilize your time well while you're still young. Okay, do the stuff that you think is going to help you, and go for the things that you want, and then definitely utilize your brain as much as you can. And now because we have also talked about neuroplasticity before, right? And then neuroplasticity just kind of suggests that we can always better our brain as much as possible. So don't waste this golden year of your life while you are in your 20s and 30s, because this is when your executive functioning really is at its highest. I mean, I'm not saying that after you're 40 you become like really dumb, but then after 40, of course, you can rely on your experiences. You can there are a lot of knowledge that are being gained, and then there are a lot of mistakes that you won't make that you did in your early 20 years or in your early 30s. But you see that in at 20 or 30 years old, this is when your brain really is at its peak in terms of performance. Okay. Now let's talk about the development of problem-solving abilities. Okay. Now the Piaget's theory depicting children at a given age as using a particular strategy to solve a particular class of problems. Okay. So he talked about a 5-year-old as solving conversation of number problems. Okay. And then they do this by choosing like a longer row of objects, and the 7 years old they solve the same problem by reasoning, okay, that if nothing was added was subtracted, the number of objects must remain the same. Okay, now according to the overlapping waves theory or the overlapping waves model, basically individual children usually use a variety of approaches to solve problems. Okay, so this is what basically what you're looking at is the overlapping wave model. Okay, it proposes that at any one age, children use multiple strategies, and then with the age and experience, they rely increasingly on more advanced strategies. Okay, and so you'll see that. So here, what you're reading is that strategy one would actually mean that it's the least sophisticated strategy. Okay, and strategy five would mean that it's the most advanced strategy. So you see that when children are younger, they are more likely to use less sophisticated or more primitive kind of strategy to solve problems. And what happens when they get to like when they get older, then they're more likely to use sophisticated strategies. And then you can see that in this middle part, you see a lot of overlapping of strategies. They might use a combination of strategy one, strategy two, strategy three, strategy four, and five. So there are multiple strategies to solve problems while the children are developing. But then you can see that later on, when people get older, they realize that this XYZ strategy, let's say strategy one, is pretty primitive. They think that, okay, I don't really need to use this strategy in order to solve this problem. So they abandon them. Okay. And then strategy two, by the same token, when the children becomes older and older, they tend to use it less and less and less because they realize that maybe it's more time um, consuming. Okay, it might take too much time, and that's not therefore not the most efficient way of solving the problem. And they might also kind of also realize, let's say strategy four or strategy five are better suited for this particular time, particular kind of problem that needs to be solved, and therefore they use this in order to maximize their time and their as well as their efficiencies. And it could also be due to that the strategy four and five are the ones that are more useful for the type of problems that they really need to come in contact with later on in their life. So you see that it really becomes one of those things that the overlapping wave model is kind of suggesting. Now let's talk about processing speed. Now let's say when two people are doing things exactly the same way, and then they both came up with the same answer, and how do you determine who is smarter? Well, the way you determine smarter is who did them faster, right? So you can see that processing speed really is a very important aspect of cognitive process as well. So over here on left in the panel A, what we're looking at is the mental rotation speed, in which that the scientists give the subjects or the participants to look at an image and then ask them to flip it either let's say 180 degrees or like 90 degrees or 45 degrees or something like that. And then they ask them, give them a bunch of choices and say that which one is the correct answer. Okay, and you can see that on the x-axis, what we're seeing is from 8 years of age all the way to 23 years of age, right? And then on the y-axis, what we're seeing is the mean rotation time that it took them to get this task done. And all the dots here, the blue dots, these are the individual data points. And then the red line is the best fitting line. Okay, and you can see that. So the best fitting line really is telling us a trend in how the data really look. And you can see that what the data are really showing is that at 8 years of age, their processing time is still not that great, which means that it took a lot longer for them to do exactly the same task in mental rotation, and then let's say a 23 or a 22-year-old guy. Okay, so you can see that over the years, when the children are developing, their processing speed is enhanced, which means that it takes them less amount of time in terms of the reaction time to get exactly the same task being done. Okay, and we see basically the same thing in mental addition. Okay, so mental addition is they have them do math in their head and then how quickly they can do them. Okay, and so you can see that at 8 years of age they don't do it very well, and and the general trend is that there is a significant decreased amount of reaction time that it needs them to get this task done. Okay, so as you can see, that processing speed is improved with mental maturation or the maturation of age as well. But something that I want to show, I want to add here is that they only show you up to 23 years of age, right? When it comes to the other end of the spectrum, when people get to their 60s and 70s, you see that this processing time they go back up again, okay? Which means that the older someone is, the more speed it takes them to get something done. Okay, and then you're probably thinking that, well, that makes sense. Yeah, my grandma takes a long time to get something done, where it takes them forever to read newspaper and stuff like that. And that is why, okay? So you can see that the processing speed really follows it really follows a U shape, sorry, not inverted U, just U, okay. It follows a U shape in which that it's slow when they're young, quick when they're like in the 20s and the 30s, and then slow again in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to go over is working memory. Okay. So working memory development, now I'm only going to talk about working memory because this is really part of the executive function. Okay. Now long-term memory, in general, long-term memory, it's more like an issue with like retrieval versus storage versus encoding. And now there are a lot of aspects about memory. If you're interested, and if like DKU actually offers a course like that, I am more than glad to teach them. But right now, I just don't think we have that plan yet. But later on, if it becomes available, I would love to teach them if it's something that I know that a lot of people are very interested in. But I'm just going to pick out this one aspect of memory development and it's because we really know a lot about working memory development, okay? So what is working memory? Well, working memory is one aspect of memory in which that you can briefly hold the things that you have encoded in your brain and you can briefly manipulate them. And you're probably thinking that I still don't know what you mean. Okay, so I'll give you a demonstration of working memory. So let's say I am going to tell you 3 to 4 letters. I can either tell them in letters, or I can tell them to you in numbers. Okay, but then I'm going to mix them up. But what I want you to do is I want you to first tell me in alphabetical orders the letters, and then I want you to tell me in sequence the numbers. Okay, so let's say if I give you something like a string of letters like J, K, 8, 6, B. And then, okay, and then what you need to do then is to reorganize them in your head into the alphabets first. So you'll need to give it to me in B, J, K, 6, 8. Okay, 8. Okay, so what have you just done? Okay, so what basically I just gave you a bunch of letters and numbers to encode, right? And your job is to reorganize them, and not just reorganize them in terms of the order that they go in the alphabet or in numbers. But what you also need to do is you need to separate them based on whether they are alphabets or if they're letters, right? So basically what you have done is you have stored them briefly in your mind first, and then you have manipulated them based on the categories, and then you need to flip them around. You need to remember what orders they go into. So you can see that this is the component of working memory. Now this is like the easiest demonstration of what working memory is, okay? And there are a lot of aspects when it comes to the working memory that we can also go through. Now in the Baddeley's model, this is a professor that spent a lot of time investigating what working memory is. Okay, so he kind of proposed that there is aspect when it comes to the language and the sound, and okay, and then there is another aspect with the visual space and movements, and then there is another one that involves time and order. Now there are very specific names with that because this is not an advanced class on memory. I won't tell you just like their formal names because you don't really need to know them. What you do need to know them is this thing in the right, okay, and that is your working memory development as a function of age, okay. So the number of items that they can correctly recall and also really trying to manipulate is you can see that at 5 years of age they're not very good at doing this kind of task, okay. But then and you can see that when they go up, it really doesn't matter if it's visual or if it's verbal. I think I had that mixed up. On the one on the left is verbal and the one on the right is visual. Okay, so you can see that it doesn't really matter if it's visual or is it verbal. They both go up kind of like a linear fashion, right? And then they peak around 16 years of age, and then is maintained somewhere around when it's like 40 years of age, sometime between 35 and 40 years of age, right? And then after that, this working memory starts to decline a little bit, okay? And now this is something that is very similar to the processing speed that we've seen before. Instead, like this is more like an inverted U or inverted V, whatever you want to call it, okay? So you see that this is the idea of this cognition that a lot of the cognitive abilities, the way that it works is that they're pretty good in the middle part of the lifespan, but they're I won't say especially bad, but they're just not as good when the animal is younger, when the human is younger, or we're older. Okay, so you can see that the the progression as well as the regression of the cognitive development really kind of follows either a U shape or an inverted U shape. Let's say if your x-axis is age. Okay. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the individual differences in cognitive development. Now, there are many factors that can contribute to differences in intelligence quotient. Okay, intelligence quotient, you know it better as IQ, is really a way to measure how smart a person is, to put it in layman's terms. Okay, now these are a series of standardized tests that basically compare where you stand compared to your peers, okay, the people who are in your same age. And then, so if you, and then let's say if you are one standard deviation away from the mean, then you are, your score is 15 scores higher than like 100. So let's say if you have an IQ of 130, that means that you're two standard deviations away from the mean, which puts you around like 95 percentile compared to the rest of the population. Now, if your IQ is 145, that means you're three standard deviation away from the mean, and that actually means that you're about 99.5% smarter compared to the rest of the population who are in your same age groups. Okay, now the factors that can really contribute to differences in IQ are, I list them over here. So genetics. So smarter parents tend to give birth to smarter kids and vice versa. And there is just no way to kind of get away with it. Okay, now of course genetics is not always that case, because smarter parents, they might also have genetic defects, and then they could give birth to, let's say, I don't want to use the word mental retardation kids, but then can also give birth to kids that have a genetic defect that really affects their cognitive development and or their IQ. Okay, so this is something that you should also kind of pay attention to. Okay, so that's the first factor. The second factor is the academic enrichment thus far. Okay, academic enrichment, you kind of think about environmental enrichment. This is just enrichment focusing on academia. Now, if the kids really get exposed to some sort of elite education early on, while the plasticity is the highest, this is very good in terms of the cognitive development. Now you remember the musician's brain example, right? So the musician's brains are much more active. They have much more processing capacity when it comes to non-musicians. And this is because they receive a lot of musical enrichment. So the same thing applies to academic enrichment when they are in a very young age. Okay, so this is why cram school is very popular, and then just also elite education is very important. Okay, and of course, when you push too hard, then the issue really becomes that you might be introducing juvenile stress, and that is actually counterproductive when it comes to the cognitive development. Okay, and also not just cognitive development, but also emotional development. That is also very bad. Okay. Okay. Now the next factor can really contribute that is nutrition. So nutrition during growing up is definitely very important, because there are key nutrients that a child really needs in order for them to have the maximum capacity when it comes to synaptogenesis as well as synaptic pruning, and which are both signs of cognitive development and neuronal maturations, right? So the nutrition, and on top of that, there are several key nutrients. So for instance, copper or vitamin B6 or zinc, these are all very key nutrients for proper neuronal functioning, and especially when it comes to the neurotransmitter production as well as release. And so nutrition really plays a very important role in influencing the cognitive developments. And now, temporarily lacking a nutrient, it does not it does not do too much harm, but a chronic lacking of a nutrient can be very, very detrimental to the actual cognitive development of a child that is growing up. Okay, now the last one, now of course there are many more factors that I haven't said here, but these four are the most notable factors that really contribute to differences in IQ. All right, so the fourth one is the group differences. So group differences, if you're thinking that, what do you mean, the group differences? So I'll give you an example. Now remember we talked about mental rotation in several slides back. Well, mental rotation abilities are different between male versus females. Boys tend to do slightly better than girls. Okay, and I mean, there's nothing for me to say. Just like there are just certain tasks that boys are slightly better, and there are certain tasks that girls are better. So, for instance, verbal tasks, girls are slightly better than boys. Okay, so there are group differences also when it comes to the differences in IQ. And IQ, when you kind when you kind of think about it, they really come from many aspects of well, they come from very many aspects, and then I'll talk about it in the next slide. So how do they come up with an IQ score? Okay, so you see that the IQ score, they really have two major aspects. So this is an example from the Wechsler scale for intelligence, WAIS. Okay, so you can see that you have a full scale IQ, but within that, you have the verbal IQ and you have the performance IQ. Okay, so the performance IQ can be further subdivided into perceptual organization, and then it can be also with processing speed. Okay, and then within the verbal IQ, you can have the verbal comprehension and working memory index. Okay, and then you'll see that each one of these tests is falls basically under a sub division of the IQ. Okay, so each one of this, let's say a picture completion, that's one test. Okay, so they will actually give you, they won't give you all 15, is it 15? Something like that. 7 plus also 12. So they won't give you all 12 tests over here to get your full IQ. But then they will actually test you like a few of the selections to really have a good idea what is your verbal comprehension, for instance, and what is your working memory, for instance, what is your perceptual organization. And now, I have said that, let's say, girls are slightly better in when it comes to the verbal comprehension index, right? Because the girls are, in general, I'm not saying not all girls are better than all boys, okay? But just that girls, in general, they are slightly better in doing the verbal comprehension index. But then boys are slightly better when it comes to the perceptual organization index. Now, this is just the basic group differences that is in that. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that when you kind of look at all of these indices together, and then you come up with a full scale IQ all the way on the top, it becomes a wash. It balances out the individual differences because each person will have their own strength and their own weaknesses. Okay, and this becomes very important when it comes to the IQ. Okay. Now let's wrap up for tomorrow's discussion. Okay, so for tomorrow's discussion, I want to talk about the role of the cram school, and the cram school really is about academic enrichment, as we said in here, right? So I want to see, so we're only going to have one discussion tomorrow, but I do one group presentation tomorrow, I mean. So, but I really want you guys to have a good idea what do you want to talk about, and what do you think is an adequate thing to kind of discuss when it comes to cram school, and as a right to push hard, and when is pushing too hard, And I think that's going to be the most central idea when it comes to tomorrow's discussion. All right, so I'll see you guys tomorrow.